We're going to talk about, for a moment, objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity and subjectivity. There is a world that exists independent of my thoughts about me. And I need to understand that world. I need to define myself and understand even my purposes and my role in life in light of the world I find myself in. I've had people say to me, I don't need other books, I've got the Bible. If this is a hard-working Nebraska farmer who's putting in 12, 14 hours a day on his farm and he can only have time to read one book, he's made a wise choice. But most of the people that say, I don't need other books, I've got the Bible, they're probably moving towards a fairly self-referential approach to life. And I have met pastors before who pretty soon, I don't need other books, I've got the Bible. The Bible pretty much operates for them like a ventriloquist dummy operates for the ventriloquist. They start painting thus saith the Lord across their own opinions. We live in a world where we can gain from perspective of other people. I remember not long ago, actually it's probably been about 5 years now, I had 5 people in 3 weeks come up to me and say to me, I needed to read Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature shortly after he wrote that book. I had not read it, and never in my life have I had 5 people in a 3-week period of time tell me to read one book. So I thought, well, I better go read it. The book is a novel set in Mexico in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when the whole world was hell-bent chasing after Marxism. There's a state in Mexico that has felt the Catholic Church was too much in the pocket of the bourgeoisie and not responsible to the proletariat. So consequently, they've declared in that state that the Catholic Church is illegal. Many of the pastors, priests, have fled the state. Some have abandoned the Catholic Church and taken wives so that they will be disassociated with the Catholic Church. Some of the priests have been rounded up, given kangaroo trials, and been executed by firing squad. But there's one priest, the main character of the book, who keeps going from village to village. He is baptizing babies. If you understand Catholic theology, that becomes an important thing. He's solemnizing marriage vows. He's giving last rites to the dying, and he's administering the Eucharist. But his name is never given in the book. He's simply called the whiskey priest because he has an alcohol problem. And he never knows when he gets to the next village if he's going to have the Eucharist wine or if he'll have drank it. He has an illegitimate child. His life is all messed up. But still he stays committed to this ministry. And there's a soldier who's always a day behind him, chasing him throughout that state. So I'm reading this book about this messed up person in ministry, wondering why did 5 people recommend this book to me? And I'm also reading the book of Proverbs while I'm reading The Power and the Glory. Proverbs is a book that contrasts the righteous man with the wicked man. It contrasts the wise man with the fool. It contrasts the industrious person with the lazy person. Nobody would take me seriously if I tried to pass myself off as the righteous, wise, industrious person. But I have grown weary of being the wicked, the fool, and lazy. I'm a person in the middle, longing to move from this side of the ledger to the other side of the ledger. And those questions awakened in me when I read The Power and the Glory, and I brought those questions to the book and started to look at Proverbs in a fresh way. How many of you reading through the Bible, every time you read it, you see something you never saw before? I think it's a testimony to the fact that this book was given by omniscience. I also think sometimes it's because every time we reread it, we bring fresh questions to the text. And it lowers down our conscious understanding of that text to the particular place where we benefit that time from that particular text. I've also read the Bible where I've seen questions that I just don't get. I say, man, what's that all about? I have 9 mentoring groups at Wheaton this last year. 8 of them I met with every week, different groups, and 1 I met with once a month. I want to apostasy-proof my students' faith. I don't want to hear 20 years later they're not walking with Jesus anymore. And so this is a concern to me, and with 2 of the groups, we spent about 6 months talking about the very difficult questions in the Bible. And how do we deal with those questions? What does a scientist do when they're waiting for an experiment to percolate? They put it in a pending tray. They hold it there for a while. You come to those difficult questions, put it in a holding tray. Next time you come through the Bible, you might see the answer, maybe 2 times later. I've had this happen so many times that when somebody says, oh, I've read the Bible, it's full of contradictions and questions. I say, I can't take you very seriously. Because now finishing up my 47th read, I've seen so many of those resolved over the years. Why would I believe that the others that come up next read or the read after that? I'm never surprised about the depths of this book and the resolutions to these things. So there's an objectivity. The world exists independent of our thoughts about it. The scriptures are an objective revelation of God. It exists independent of my thoughts about it. Sometimes I can project on it. I want to minimize the projection, and I want to begin to define myself by that objective reality. My intellectual grasp of any matter must correspond to reality. Okay, I want us to, in a moment, break into 2s. All of our lives we've been saying that's true or that's not true. You must, if you've ever made that judgment, have a good definition for truth. The definition that you can find it in Plato's Cratylus, you can find it in Aristotle's Metaphysics, you can even find it in the writings of John Locke. There have always been anomalies that have percolated in any generation. The basic thing is that there's a reality that supports the truth claim. This is a pen. That's true. Aristotle would say a statement is true when it says what is, or what is not, and a statement is false when it says what is not, or what is not, is. Only the word statement was more than 1 syllable in that whole definition. Simple definition. This is a pen, true. Why? Because I said what is. This is not an elephant, true, because I said what is not. This is an elephant, false, because I said what is not is. This is not a pen, false, because I said what is not. Now that's easy with material objects. It's a little harder with objects of thought, but again, objects of thought we come to by virtue of an agreed definition, and then we begin to reason inferentially from that particular thing. There has to be a reality to support a truth claim. That which is asserted by a false statement will give you honor where honor is due. That which is asserted by a false statement does not exist. False statements exist, but that which is asserted by a false statement does not. This is an elephant, false, because I said what is not is. And so consequently, what we recognize is that we can, as best we can get to reality, we can begin to affirm or deny falsehoods. Our character is messed up. We are fallen beings. We want to adjust the scoliosis, scoliosis, curvature of the spine. We want to adjust the scoliosis of our souls to the plumb line of reality. And the plumb line of reality is in essence given to us by Scripture. There are vestiges of it just in the way that we've been made. And we see the supreme example of it when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us in the Incarnation. So you go to churches. I remember once candidating at a church. Again, this is a horrible word, but candidating at a church, and they said to me, so what do you think of our doctrinal statement? And I said, well, your biblical anthropology is atrocious. It's bad. And they said, how's that? And I said, you said in your doctrinal statement that man is sinful by nature. The word by is a preposition of essence. If you would have said man is sinful in his nature, that would have been fine. But in is a preposition of intrusion. And you want me to believe that I can understand the nature of man by virtue of his fallen state? You have diminished the reality. So in reality, if we go back and look at it, 4 areas of theology are affected by your doctrine of man. Your doctrine of God, theology proper. The Scriptures say in Him there is no darkness at all. If man is sinful by nature, God would have had to have made us sinful. So consequently, you've got a problem. And you're not accounting for the reality that's been compromised. Second, your Christology. Did Jesus become fully man? If you say he didn't become fully man, you've got major problems in your Christology, and you need to go back and talk to the guys at Chalcedon, see if you could reconcile with them. Jesus became fully man. Was he sinful? No, the scriptures are explicit. In him there was no sin at all. So sin can't be the defining characteristic of what it means to be human. Third, your biblical anthropology. 4 categories of man in the Bible. Adam and Eve before the fall. Is sin present? No. Were they human? Yes. Adam and Eve and all who follow after the fall, the group we find ourselves in, is sin present? Yes. Are we weary of it? I hope so. You have to take this by faith, but when I was in college, I played American football. I actually played till I was 44, some form of organized American football. And I remember getting a concussion my senior year of college. And I cried out to God. I'd become a Christian about 3.5 years earlier. I cried out to God, God, please, no, it's my senior year. Don't let this happen. Everything went clear. I played till I was 44, never had another concussion. The thing was, in that moment of being concussed and fuzzy, I went to clarity. And I've often wondered, when we get to heaven, we'll realize we lived our life concussed, and we'll finally get to heaven and everything will be clear. I weary of being sinful. I weary of the body of sin and death that I carry about, and I long to be fixed. Third category, Christ in his humanity. Is sin present? No. So we got Adam and Eve before the fall, Adam and Eve and all who follow after the fall, Christ in his humanity, and when we get to heaven in our glorified state, will sin be there? 4 categories of man. Sin's only present in one. It can't be the defining characteristic. And then you've got your doctrine of salvation. Soteriology is affected by your view or doctrine of man. If I see a pig wallowing in the mire, I don't kick the pig. He's living according to his nature. He doesn't have sweat glands. He's got to wallow. But if I see a man living in sin and degradation, do I tell him you shouldn't live like that? Why? If he's living according to his nature, let him go like you let the pig go. But when I preach the gospel, I'm saying you're not living according to your nature. Something needs to be fixed. Something's gone off the rails. And we need to fix this sort of thing. So anyway, I need to adjust the scoliosis of my soul to the plumb line of reality. And I think then when this is properly grasped and so on, it will begin to affect me intellectually, emotionally, volitionally. When we became a Christian, we weren't transformed overnight. The Bible says we were born again. Nobody after they became a Christian said, oh, I've got it. Jesus is a perfect anthropotropic person, manifest in the hypostatic union, the eschatological ground of all my hope. I think those things are true, but what did we know when we were born again? Jesus died for our sins. We were forgiven. We can have a relationship with God through him. John writes, I'm writing to you children because your sins were forgiven for his name's sake. And a process has begun in us. And that process, sometimes we can slip up and make mistakes. We know this. And sometimes we constantly need to be aware of these liabilities in us. We need to adjust the scoliosis of our soul accordingly. So there's an objective world that exists independent of my thoughts about it. This adjustment could be emotional too. If you're going to a birthday party, you shouldn't go morose. You should have a happiness about it, an excitement for your friend. That would be an emotional response that is consistent with the reality. You're on your way there and you get a phone call that one of your friends was in a horrible accident. Well, you don't go to the party then morose. Maybe call up your friends and say, something's come up, I'll tell you about it later, and you don't want to go spoil their party, but you go to the hospital to see your friend. You're going to a funeral. You don't go giddy and happy, celebratory, unless you owed the guy a lot of money or something like that. No, you go with your heart broken, even if the person's a believer. We grieve, but not as those who have no hope. We still grieve because we will be without that person for a while till we join them later. So our emotional life, our moral life should be coherent with this reality too. If our moral life is not, we will begin to rationalize it as we talked later. And It was George MacDonald who made the observation in his novel, Annals of a Quiet Neighborhood. We do not have souls. We are souls. We have bodies. He's not a Gnostic. He believes we are embodied souls. But he says if you tell a child he has a soul, he thinks like anything else he has, his books, his keys, whatever, he could lose them and leave them behind. Tell him he is a soul and that when he goes to heaven and he leaves his body behind like clipped hair on a barbershop floor, for those of you that still use barbers and stuff like that. So what makes up the soul? I think I could set forth proofs. I've read a lot about it. Not everything by any stretch. I've hardly read anything if you compare all the things that have been written in this matter. But nevertheless, I could set forth proofs for the soul. But traditionally, we've said the soul, that immaterial part of what it means to be human, is made up of a thinking part, the reason, a choosing part, the volition, and a feeling part, the emotion. I live in an academic environment. I want to tell you right now, the reason is hands down the weakest of those three. Again, if I make a bad choice, my reason doesn't say, Jerry, that's a bad decision. You follow down along that line, and all you're going to do is hurt yourself and hurt others. No, my reason being weak is marshaled by my will to make all kinds of excuses for that thing. If I'm wounded emotionally, my reason doesn't say, boy, Jerry, you need to grieve and forgive the person who hurt you so you could untether from that sad event. Remember Anne Lamott? She wrote the book Traveling Mercy. She said, bitterness is like you drinking the rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. So that we have this brokenness, this sadness, and this person could long be out of our life. They hurt us 20 years ago, but we've given them complete control of our life because we're still bitter about what they did, instead of grieving and forgiving. But our reason, being weak, is marshaled by the emotion to keep that pain, that wound, as a cyst encapsulated in our soul, filling with pus all the time. And you bump up against me, I'm going to bleed a little pus in your direction. That's why our institutions, when we're leaders, can become just extensions of our own dysfunction, because we're trying to keep from having to deal with our stuff. And so if we can get the institution to basically be an extension of our own brokenness, we don't have to deal with our stuff because we don't have to face the reality of our shortcomings. It's very interesting to me. So anyway, I need to say something then a little further on this, and that has to do with subjectivity. So you have objects of thought or objects in the real world. And we have subjectivity. That's our emotional response, our intellectual response, our volitional response. The knower's response to the object is the subjective side. When life is properly grasped, our subjective understanding is in concert with reality, intellectually, emotionally, volitionally. The literary critic Terry Eagleton made the judgment, the subjective is a matter of value, while the world is a matter of fact. And we want our values to be coherent with the facts. We must adjust then the scoliosis of our soul to the plumb line of reality. Let me say a few words about this. Something I like to say about C.S. Lewis, probably one of my favorite things that he wrote. He gave a lecture at Oxford University in the 1930s to students, and he says, we fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given tract of reality. In other words, you could see this book that we're talking to you about as something different from yourself. So you're adjusting your understanding of that book according to the reality of the book, not projecting on the book what you want it to be. This reality that Lewis talked about too, by the way, he believed was infused with the very presence of God. God walks everywhere incognito, he said. We need to awaken to him and even more remain awake to him. It was a little bit like Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem where she said, every bush is a burning bush and the world is crowded with God. Or as Lewis said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. We go through a difficulty, and that difficulty is a reality. We don't have to then deny that difficulty, but incline towards that difficulty at some level. There's a line that Lewis, a paragraph he has in the last book he wrote before he died called Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer. It may be my favorite of his books. I don't know. Usually I say my favorite is whichever one I'm reading at that moment. There's 73 titles in all. But this one, it's a book of worship and adoration. It's a book that shows us the tenderness of a man's heart before he's going to go meet God. In this paragraph, I'm going to define a term for you in the paragraph. It's the word coruscation. And I don't define it to insult your intelligence. You probably already knew it, but when I first read that word, I had no clue what it meant. Coruscation is a sudden flash of brightness. I grew up in Southern California. We didn't have fireflies there. The only fireflies I'd ever seen was in this ride at Disneyland called Pirates of the Caribbean, but they were all mechanical. But in the Midwest, I love to see fireflies on a humid summer evening coruscating in the back garden. Or our weather comes from the west eastward. And if we have dark, foreboding storm clouds coming our way, you can see lightning coruscating in the clouds. So you got the idea? So Lewis makes a distinction between gratitude and adoration or worship. And he says, gratitude exclaims very properly, how good of God to give me this. But adoration asks, what must that being be like whose far off and momentary coruscations are like this? One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. I remember reading that it was at the time when Voyager, the interplanetary probe, was speeding past Saturn, taking pictures so close up for the first time. And I was amazed when I saw the pictures that they discovered that there's an outer ring of Saturn called the F ring, and it's braided. And I said, you're kidding. Though no human eye had ever seen it before, God chose to braid the outer ring of Saturn. I have a really close friend. He's a physicist. He used to teach at Oxford University. I said, Robert, why is the outer ring braided? He said, Jerry, these are the questions that keep us physicists up way late into the night. I've read 5 different explanations. Each is a negation of the other 4. I think one day the physicists will tell us, but in the meantime, I say, asking Lewis's question, what must God be like that he chose to braid the outer ring of Saturn? I think of fish that are in the bowels of the ocean, deeper than the light of the sun could reach. And when we dangle cameras into those depths, they take pictures of fish painted neon bright. Why? Can't be to attract a mate. How do those fish get together at those depths? That's interesting in its own right. But nevertheless, what must God be like that he painted fish with color in the bowels of the ocean? I grew up in Southern California. I like to see palm trees silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky, or a mountain range silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. Now I live in the Midwest of the United States. A cornfield silhouetted against an auburn sunset sky. There's beauty there if you'd willingly distill it out. But we could have lived on a dark planet and gotten word from on high there would be one sunset, and we could have lined every west coast of every continent on our planet and regaled our progeny writing of the glory of that event in our journals and diaries. But what must God be like that he's made our planet a perpetual kaleidoscope of sunrises and sunsets? You see a glorious sunset and it dissolves before your eyes and you feel the grief of its dissolution. Don't worry, he's so liberal with these things, he'll give you another one. Or one star twinkling in a night sky should be enough to awaken wonder and awe in the mind and heart of every right-thinking, right-feeling individual. But what must God be like that he has glittered the night sky with stars and moons and shooting stars and suns and galaxies, the northern lights, the aurora borealis? Have any of you seen them before? I saw them once in reds and greens and blues and whites when I was teaching in the Northwoods campus of Wheaton College up by Lake Superior. And I stood with students from midnight till 2:30 in the morning, watching them dance before our eyes magically. And we did the only thing that seemed appropriate. We sang hymns of praise and thanked God for the glory of that magical evening. What must God be like that he made delicate things like butterflies and hummingbirds, flower petals, and peacock feathers? Wow. But Lewis is too honest a scholar to ever let us stop there. He forces us to ask these kinds of questions too, which if we're going to look at reality accurately, we have to consider. What must God be like that there are earthquakes in Haiti, tsunamis in Japan, AIDS babies born in Africa, too many school shootings in America. Lewis says if our religion is something objective, there it is again, if our religion is something objective, we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent. For it's precisely in the puzzling or repellent where we begin to discover what we do not yet know and need desperately to know. So you're faced with a conundrum in your leadership responsibilities. What do? Do you avoid it because of something going on inside of you? Or do you incline towards it in order to discover what God might be giving you in that event? What you can learn from that event? Do you dismiss the person who's causing you trouble? Or do you begin to ask, what's going on in this person's life? What preceded their having these particular contemptible behaviors? Maybe they were beat up. Have any of you ever worked with high control people? Most of the high control people I've worked with have some sort of deep pain in their life, and the way they manage that pain is they weren't in control when they were hurt, and they don't want to let go of control now because they don't want to hurt anymore. How do you reach that person? And I think if you're aware of your own stuff, you end up talking to that person, you say, in a manner completely different than this place where they're in control, tell me about your life. Where'd you grow up? Ask public questions. Public questions are okay. Listen to the answers. And when you listen to the answers, you'll get permission to go deeper. And as you ask deeper and deeper levels of questions, eventually you come to the place where there was something in their life where they were hurt. A lot of times they'll be dismissive of it, or they cover it up, or they suppress it. And when they finally let down their guard and tell you something that was painful, you could say, wow, that sounds really sad. And they may say to you, yeah, I know, yeah, it was sad. And they just go right over it. You say again to them, that was really sad. I mean, that was really sad. I can't believe that happened to you. And pretty soon you start to see the tears coming. It means you've sounded the depths a little bit. And you start talking to them about the sadness, and they're able to deal with the reality emotionally and stop suppressing the emotion so that you can start to deal with them on a more holistic way. So that's the subjective side. We've got these emotional issues that are at play in our lives. But now we've got, with this comparison between the objective world and our subjective understanding of it, we move to what C.S. Lewis called subjectivism. And that's when we're no longer, in our own emotional pain, responsible for the objective reality. We project on the objective reality what we want it to be, so we could get by. We deal with it artificially. It's centered in self, and it's not responsive to the real world. And now we're moving towards lack of self-awareness. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. This is important. If we misunderstand things, we've had to accommodate our whole understanding of the world to that misunderstanding. I was in the bathroom. I don't know what you call it in your countries. We call it a bathroom. There's no bath in these rooms whatsoever, but somehow we think we're being more polite. In England, they call it the loo or the water closet or whatever. But nevertheless, I was in the bathroom at the Billy Graham Center on the 3rd floor. I was making a full deposit, so I was in the stall. I heard somebody come into that room. I finished up my work, and I come out of the door of the stall, and I see a woman fixing her makeup in the bathroom. She sees me come out of the stall and starts berating me for being in the women's bathroom. Clearly, we have a difference in conceptual framework. It was the easiest argument I ever had to resolve. I pointed and said, urinals. She screamed and ran out of that bathroom. And I've never seen her since. She must have been a visitor. She wouldn't have gone into that bathroom by mistake. C.S. Lewis was leading the Oxford Socratic Club. The Oxford Socratic Club, a Christian would read a paper one week, and the non-Christians would respond. The next week, a non-Christian would read a paper, the Christians would respond. Lewis was the first president of the Oxford Socratic Club, and it was a way of reaching Oxford students for Christ. So one week, there was a relativist who was arguing with Lewis. And he said to him, how do you know there isn't just a blue piano a blue cow on that piano over there? And Lewis said, what shade of blue? Obviously, you can't answer the question because there's no blue cow to refer to. There's no reference. He was projecting on reality. And so consequently, the subjectivist starts to lose touch with reality in some senses. Why? Because they're usually rationalizing bad behavior. The difference between truth and opinion has to also be understood. I can't always get to truth. So what can I do? I can sometimes come to opinion. Opinion is based on probability rather than reality. It's subject to doubt, and reasonable people could differ on matters of truth. I want to make sure that I see the difference between truth and opinion, so I'm not projecting on somebody by virtue of their opinion that my opinion somehow trumps theirs. No, I need to be open to the discussion. On matters of truth, I need to be sure. On matters of opinion, I need to be open. But let's say it is a matter of truth. This is a pen. Is that true? Yes. It's a sure word. It's not a last word. If Aristotle was here, he would say there's a material cause. There's an efficient cause, a pen maker. There's a final cause, the purpose for which it was made. There is a formal cause, the pattern after which it was made. We could talk about its length, its width. We could talk about the chemical compound of the ink. This is just a pen. It's a simple thing, but I don't think I'm ever going to get to the bottom of it. The truths I know are sure words, but not last words. I can hold them with confidence, but I hold them with humility, because I haven't yet plumbed the depths of those things, and I haven't considered all the possible applications of those things. And if I violate that humility in my own approach to truth, I have to ask myself, why? Why do I have to have it be that way? What's going on inside of me? Why can't I consider, even if somebody disagrees with me, that maybe they're seeing something different? When we get the Gospels, we get 4 Gospels, not 1. We get several angles at looking at the life of Christ. They're sure words, but neither one of the Gospels alone is a full word. And even when John writes his Gospel, he says if everything that could have been written about Jesus would have been written, the libraries of the world couldn't contain all the books. And we can understand greater and greater depths of these things. I think that is important. Failure at this point is disastrous, and it leads to a lack of checks on self, referentialism, and it leaves us at risk of creating organizations that are extensions of our own dysfunction. I want to say a few things. How much time do we have left?
We have about a half hour.
About a half hour. Okay, so I want to say a few things now they might seem too academic, maybe. What follows may appear to be academic, but I think it's important for leaders to grasp. When I was in college, I had no interest in academic things except to stay eligible for sports. I became a Christian. I started reading my Bible. My mind started to wake up. I started to study. I was sharing my faith. People were asking me questions. I was trying to find answers to their questions. But I wasn't academically inclined at that time. It was my father who suggested maybe I should be a chaplain in the military. So that meant I had to go to seminary. That meant I had to go to school longer. I wasn't academically inclined. I'm in seminary, and I'm thinking of all the reasons I would rather be out doing ministry rather than studying about ministry. And I went to a retreat. It was a college retreat. There were about 200 students there, and there were 18 of us who were seminarians. And the guy who was the leader, the speaker, he wanted to meet with all the seminarians. He was a bit jaded, I noticed, in his talk, a bit cynical about some things. But as he met with us seminarians, he said, I just want you to know, having been through seminary, that 30% of seminary is learning answers to questions people never ask. And I go, then what am I doing in seminary? I could be out doing ministry. But his attitude gave me pause. And then as I thought more about it, I had more pause. Let's say you've got a cough. Something's wrong with your respiratory system. And you go to the doctor and you don't ask him anything about your adrenal system, your circulatory system. And do you want him to know about all those things even though you don't ask him about them because you've got a cough? You take your car to the mechanic. You got something wrong with the carburetor. I want the mechanic to know everything there is to know about the internal combustion engine if he's going to work on my car. And I think these things are important. And if you're in ministry and in leadership, you want to know more than the questions that people are going to ask. And if you don't want to know more, you've got to ask yourself why. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to know that 30%. Why? Because I had not been mature enough to know that if I want to do ministry well, I should incline myself to know more than what the person may be asking at the moment. If you work with computers and you have a problem, you want the computer technology support people to know more about the computer than you do at that moment, or you'll still be stuck in the conundrum. So I want to talk for a moment about ontology, and I want to talk for a moment about teleology. Ontology, it comes from the Greek word ontos. The Greek word emi means I am. The participle form ontos means being or existence. The basic question of ontology in philosophy is if anything exists in a universe of contingencies, something must be eternal and necessary. What is it? When you were a kid and you took dominoes and you set them up on the coffee table and serpentined them around, did you ever do that? Something outside the dominoes had to exist to set them up. Something outside the dominoes had to exist to push the first one over that caused the chain reaction of them all going down. You are contingent beings. You're here because your parents were there years ago and you were conceived. They were there because their parents were there, etc., etc. You're also here because by some means of transportation you got here. You're here also because somehow in your life you've been led so that you became a leader of an organization. There are all kinds of contingencies that lead to you being here. In a universe of contingencies, that means if there's a time when something is that once wasn't, there'd be a time then when nothing is unless there was something that was necessary and eternal that transcended the string of contingencies. What is that? And the views that have been suggested is that things just happen. Nobody takes that view very seriously. Another view is that matter is eternal. Matter is eternal. In America, every junior high kid is indoctrinated towards materialism in the school without our knowing it because our critical apparatus isn't in place far enough to understand. What we're told is, maybe some of you in your country's got this as well. If you know the end of this phrase, finish it for me. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. We were told that in school. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Really, that's a materialistic presupposition that was fed into us before our critical apparatus was there to challenge it. And I need to talk about this for a second because C.S. Lewis, I study his writings, he was an atheist, even when he went to teach at Oxford University, and he had to have a worldview that would allow him to hold his atheism, so he was a materialist. And the materialist basically says that matter is eternal. And that matter is neither created nor destroyed. It just recalibrates itself. But Lewis, as he was thinking about this, thought about it and said, yeah, okay, so you talk to a person, and how did we move then from mere rocks to the realm of ideas, or the realm of love, or the realm of concern about justice? What happened there? And the radical materialist will say it's all matter. There's no conflict here. The man doesn't love the woman. He looks at her, she projects an image on the retina of his eye, it travels along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. He says it's love, it's just chemistry. Just chemistry. There's no real love. There's no real justice. Just chemistry. And Lewis bought that until he started thinking about it, and he started thinking, well, wait a second, does the materialist want me to believe that what he says is true? Because he just looked at the lovers. They projected an image on the retina of his eye. It traveled along his optic nerve, stimulated his brain, caused the secretion of particular hormones. He said it was a valid explanation. It was just chemistry too. In other words, if it was chemistry for the lovers, it's got to be chemistry for the materialist. And consequently, he says, I can't believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. Because if you reason out of existence, then there's nothing to go on with. And it doesn't account for the world the way we know it, so therefore there must be something transcendent, something immaterial that can account for the world the way that we experience it. And when Lewis bought that, he then started to move rather rapidly towards Christian faith. In light of this, then, we also talk about the fact that if God creates, if our ontology drifts towards metaphysics, and we believe that God creates, then we can also believe that God intended. Creation implies intention. When the potter throws clay on the wheel, the potter already has an idea of what he or she wants to make with that clay. A bowl, a cup, a pitcher, a vase. Creation implies intention. Dante, everybody knows about the Vita Nuova, the book he wrote when he met Beatrice on the streets of Florence, the Ponte Vecchio. And they all know about the Divine Comedy. But between those two books, Dante wrote two other books, the Convivo and the De Monarchia. I mean, we know about the Divine Comedy. He wrote the De Monarchia. It means of the monarch. And Dante has a line in there where he says, function precedes essence. Function precedes essence. What God called me to do, my function, preceded his giving me the gifts necessary to do that particular thing. When God creates light, he does it on first day in creation account in Genesis 1. What day does he create the luminaries? Day 4. He creates the function before he creates the essences to fulfill the function. You are not a surprise to God. The omniscient God, the omnitemporal God, never had a moment in all eternity where he didn't know that you were going to be on the scene. He knew what he wanted you to do. He had purposes assigned to you, and he gave you the exact gifts you needed to fulfill those purposes. We go around in life and we look at other people and we say, how come I'm not like that person? Or maybe I'm glad I'm not like that person. But nevertheless, in making comparisons, we miss out on the delight that God took when he made us. It was Oscar Wilde, the Victorian playwright, who said, be yourself. Everybody else is already taken. And what we have to do is try to communicate that with the people that we're ministering to as well. And try to help them see not only how uniquely they're wired, and encourage them to fulfill their function in God's design and purpose, but also maybe even to help them understand how the brokenness in their life and the sadness of their life can also be used for kingdom good. So it says the role of the pastor-teacher, the leader in ministry. The role of the pastor-teacher is to what? Ephesians 4:12. Equip the saints. Equip the saints for ministry. The Greek word that's used there for equip is a unique word. It's a word katartismos. Katartismos had many uses in secular Greek, but primarily two. It was a medical term that was used to talk about setting a broken bone that it might become useful again. It means to mend. It was also a nautical term, to rig a ship for full sail. So fully equipped, it could go out of the harbor and fulfill its purposes. Your ministry is to equip people by helping to mend them in Christ and helping them to be deployed in ministry for kingdom purposes. And I think that one of the sad things in our world is that often if we're not in touch with how the mending should be going on in our own life, we're probably going to be blind to our responsibility to helping the other person that we're ministering to be mended. I don't know how it is in your country, but in America, the church isn't doing its ministry. Our churches are not seeing people come to faith. And it's because I think the values of the people in the pulpit are to teach maybe, but they're not deploying. Kierkegaard had this observation, a parable. And it was, many people think that the congregation is the audience and the pastor is the performer. Kierkegaard said that's not the way it is at all. God is the audience. The congregation are the performers. And the pastor is just the guy in the prompting box to remind people of their lines in case they've forgotten. And when I read that, I also read at the same time that McDonald's, the hamburger people, they were trying to assess where they were most dramatically influencing the culture and connecting with the culture. Was it in their high-profile athletes that they were using for advertisement? Was it in their product line, the Egg McMuffin and the Big Mac? No. Was it in their charity programs, the Ronald McDonald houses? No. They discovered that where they most dramatically interfaced with the public was across 39 inches of stainless steel countertop when you and I come in to get a hamburger. That meant that the minimum wage worker who was working behind that counter was the most important person in that organization. I went to a theology conference. There were theologians, Bible teachers, at secular schools, Christian schools. There were pastors of large churches. And I asked 40 of them at one time, at this one conference, where's the 39 inches of stainless steel countertop in the church? 38 of the people told me it was the pulpit. So the leader was considered to be the most important piece in that organization. So now all of a sudden the concept of ministry is, let's build bigger and bigger big tops and get more and more people in to see what the pastor's doing. And the people leave the church saying, I'll never have a ministry like our pastor, because that's what's highlighted as ministry. One person said he thought it was the narthex of the church when people were leaving the church to go out in their world. And the guy who was the ecclesiologist, Robert Sosi, said it's where every person in the pew faces their congregation during the week. That's the right answer. How come we're not deploying people, mending and deploying? How come we're not equipping? And I think sometimes you've got people, I talk with students a lot of times, they say, I want to go into ministry. So tell me what's in it for you. I just want to preach. I just want to preach. I think I've got something to say. So they want ministry so everybody will come and hear them preach. Well, preaching's important, it's good. But that's not the end. Function precedes essence. They're wired, maybe they can preach, but to what end are you preaching? Are you mending and are you deploying? And if I'm not, then I need to look at what's going on inside of me in order that I might see that part mended, so I might have a refocus of the reality that God has called me to in leadership and ministry. There's more that could be said, but I'm going to open up for question and answer in just a moment. But I want to end with two quick stories. I had a woman, a student at Wheaton, and I didn't have office hours at this particular time, but she just busted in my office. Opened the door, came right in, and said, Jerry, I've got to talk with you. I've got to talk with you. All my life, I've struggled with performance issues. All my life. And today I heard in chapel a speaker, Carol Anderson, and she told me the things that she said was that I can trust that God loves me the way I am. I don't have to perform to get His favor. I said, that's fabulous. Sit down, we've got to pray. And we worship God for what she had discovered that day. And then after we were done praying, I said, you said you've struggled with this all your life. What's that about? She said, well, I suppose you're going to tell me it's my parents. I said, I'm not going to tell you anything of the sort. I don't know the answer. She said, well, my sister thinks it's my parents. I said, I haven't said anything to you about your parents, and you've defended them twice. What's that all about? At that moment, the dam broke. And she told me about growing up in a missionary home where her father would control with attention. If you did what he wanted, he would stroke you. If you didn't do it exactly like he wanted, he would ignore her. And she told me one time she went 3 weeks where he wouldn't even talk with her or look at her. She came into her room, he looked over her head. And here's a young adolescent girl who needs a father's attention, and whatever's going on wrong with him, he can't see beyond his own need in that circumstance to placate his need, and he's basically violating his daughter. Wow. 20 minutes she talked about it. It was sad. I was sad when I heard it. At the end of 20 minutes, she said, I don't think I'll ever be able to love my parents. I said, it's not an option available to you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, 20 minutes ago you came in and told me you learned that God loved you not based on your performance. Now you tell me you're going to withhold love to your parents based on their performance. The mark that you're getting better is that you're able to love maybe even better than what you received. and to process that, to grieve and forgive what happened, so you can untether from it. And so you can come into ministry then, broken as we are, on the mend, so that you can then mend and deploy. And if we're not in touch with that, we're in trouble. Back at the very beginning of our time together, I said, we have to learn about God's love, and it's in that context we can begin to become self-aware and functional. Second story. Jerry Sitzer, who was a historical theologian at Whitworth College in Spokane, Washington, wrote a book called The Adventure. In this book, he said we are most like God in the world when we're most unlike Him in relationship with Him. We're most like God in the world when we're most unlike Him in relationship with Him. So, if God is utterly independent, I come to Him unlike Him. I come to Him in utter dependence upon Him. Now I can go back into the world like Him, independent of the world. So I can be a giver rather than a user. The people who are self-referential will be utilitarian and using. The people who are self-aware will be empathetic. I come to Him unlike Him. I go into the world more like Him. If I catch myself in a moment of unloveliness, I go to God in my unloveliness. And I receive from Him out of the depths of the deep reservoir of His love for me, that I might go back into the world more like Him, more loving. If I find myself impatient, don't beat yourself up. Go to Him in your impatience and say, Lord, what's not yet well in me? And I need to draw on your patience in order that I might grow and get better. A little bit like what we heard last night. And then we reinsert ourselves into that situation, more patient, drawing on His rich reservoir.